It's so easy, isn't it, to issue fiery denunciations of the likes of, say, Fox News. That's the bogeyman of biased broadcasters, isn't it? Like a pantomime, we can all boo at it. So obviously propaganda, so obviously spreading falsehoods, so vulgar. You want to make common cause with a respectable American liberal and watch their eyes roll to the back of their heads in shame and embarrassment? Just mention Fox News and bingo. CNN, on the other hand, that's seen as respectable. Not propaganda from them, they're just straight down the line, right? Now, that should always have been an illusion, but CNN have utterly disgraced themselves over Gaza. Now, I'm going to start by playing you an absolutely toxic segment from CNN. It's the sort of propaganda you expect, frankly, from the news channel of a Tinpot dictatorship, which turns reality on its head and tells you that up is down and black is white. The presenter behind it, the network's chief political correspondent, Dana Bash. Brace yourself, make sure you're not in a too bad mood first. Let's have a listen, shall we?
Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Dana Bash. We start with destruction, violence, and hate on college campuses across the country. This was the scene just a short while ago at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Police clashing with protesters. 12 people were arrested. Hours earlier, protests rocked the University of Arizona, where campus police used chemical irritant munitions to remove protesters. Around the same time at UCLA, pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups were attacking each other, hurling all kinds of objects, a wood pallet, fireworks, parking cones, even a scooter. And before that, the NYPD was able to clear Columbia University after protesters barricaded themselves inside a campus building. 300 people were arrested at Columbia and City College of New York. But it is unclear how many were actually students. New York City Mayor Eric Adams warned this morning that professional outside agitators are getting involved.
There is a movement to radicalize young people, and I'm not going to wait until it's done and all of a sudden acknowledge the existence of it. This is a global problem that young people are being influenced by those who are professionals at radicalizing our children, and I'm not going to allow that to happen as the mayor of the city of New York.
Many of these protests started peacefully with legitimate questions about the war, but in many cases, they lost the plot. They're calling for a ceasefire. Well, there was a ceasefire on October 6th, the day before Hamas terrorists brutally murdered more than 1,000 people inside Israel and took hundreds more as hostages. This hour, I'll speak to an American-Israeli family whose son is still held captive by Hamas since that horrifying day that brought us to this moment. You don't hear the pro-Palestinian protesters talking about that. We will. Now, protesting the way the Israeli government, the Israeli prime minister is prosecuting the retaliatory war against Hamas is one thing. Making Jewish students feel unsafe at their own schools is unacceptable, and it is happening way too much right now.
I'm a UCLA student. I deserve to go here. We pay tuition. This is our school, and they're not letting me walk in. My class is over there. I want to use that entrance. Well, I can't take it. Will you let me go in? This could be over in a second. Just let me and my friends go in.
Again, what you just saw is 2024 in Los Angeles, harkening back to the 1930s in Europe, and I do not say that lightly. The fear among Jews in this country is palpable right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the glorious free press. Seriously, if a disintegrating dictatorship was facing mounting anti-government protests and put that kind of propaganda on their state television channel, I think they'd be pretty embarrassed. So let's start, shall we? Firstly, the way this is framed and opened is clearly an attempt to make the point that protests against Israel's genocidal war in Gaza are at the root of now what is terrible, violent disorder. There's no sense of, well, these are peaceful protests, with the right to protest being an essential democratic right, against something we can all agree surely involves an abominable level of human suffering, including the mass slaughter of children. You can certainly see in the abstract why people might object to that, can't you? Now, when it finally gets this segment to the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, she describes both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups were attacking each other. Pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups were attacking each other. This is just a straightforward deceit. That is not what happened at all. What actually happened is that a peaceful protest by UCLA students against Israel's murderous onslaught against Gaza was brutally attacked by pro-Israel thugs. That's what happened, a pro-Israel mob of thugs. They turned up wearing masks, clearly not students, certainly in most cases. They threw fireworks and they physically assaulted students. The scenes were horrific. In videos, you can hear them variously screaming things like, "Second Nakba." That is a reference to the mass violent expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, mass ethnic cleansing, which accompanied the foundation of Israel in 1948, along with around 15,000 Palestinians who were killed. Now, according to the LA Times, they reportedly, these pro-Israel thugs, yelled racist, homophobic and anti-Muslim slurs. They sprayed bear mace, ignited stink bombs and aimed green lasers in the eyes of protesters. Meanwhile, the police just stood and watched, doing nothing for hours, which even the spokesperson for the California Governor, Gavin Newsom, issued a statement saying this was unacceptable. So what on earth is Dana Bash doing by saying pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups were attacking each other? If, say, she was walking down the street and got attacked by a MAGA cap-wearing Trump supporter, would she regard it as acceptable framing if this was reported as a Trump supporter and CNN reported Dana Bash attacking each other? Or would she regard that quite correctly as hideous gaslighting given the context and the dynamics of what happened? She then goes on to spread more insidious deceit. She says, when talking about the arrested Columbia students, that it's unclear how many were actually students. Then refers to the New York City Mayor, Eric Adams, that professional outside agitators are getting involved. Honestly, this is cliched stuff. This is the sort of thing, again, you hear from dictatorships. Now, Dana Bash undoubtedly sees herself as a serious journalist, and she should know that you don't simply regurgitate claims made by politicians who are unreliable sources because they are politically hostile to protests they're describing. Where is the evidence? Does she have any? Because journalists on the ground have repeatedly made clear that simply isn't true. That inside the protests, they are students from all backgrounds, including Jewish students who played a pivotal role. Now, on the other news channel, MSNBC, the mayor was asked about these claims. Let's have a listen.
By all of this, but we've heard from your team that there are these nameless leaders who were involved. Can you tell us who they were, or at least how many of them there are?
First, I always suspected that something was happening, and I'm happy that the confirmation of my suspicion turned out to be accurate when our intelligence division briefed me on two particular individuals. One of them, husband, was arrested for terrorism.
Two individuals there he offers up. As journalist Matt Binder points out, he refuses to name them, but then references a person that the NYPD already confirmed wasn't arrested and wasn't even there. To quote that famous phrase, you wouldn't know her, she goes to a different school. It gets worse. The NYPD then went on to say there was no wife of a terrorist at Columbia protests. Absolutely outrageous stuff there. This Matt Binder, this reporter, then cites New York reporter Ali Bauman, who posted that New York City Hall sources told CBS New York that the wife of a known terrorist is with protesters on Columbia University campus. Oh, I bet they briefed that. But then she just deleted it without explanation after lots of people called her out. As Matt Binder says, if you post obvious propaganda and then delete it after everyone calls you out, you owe it to your audience as a supposed journalist to explain exactly what happened here. This part, the next part, is just something else. She says, many of these protests started peacefully with legitimate questions about the war, but in many cases they lost the plot. They're calling for a ceasefire, where there was a ceasefire on October the 6th, the day before Hamas terrorists brutally murdered more than 1,000 people inside Israel and took hundreds more as hostages. Wow, just wow. Now, firstly, I've always made it clear that terrible war crimes were committed by Hamas and other armed groups on the 7th of October. Always made that clear. What she is doing here is intentionally and willfully airbrushing all of the suffering of the Palestinian people for generations and starting the clock on the 7th of October as though there's no broader context than that. No decades of mass violent ethnic cleansing like the Nakba, which the protesters, those thugs who attacked those peaceful protesters certainly knew about because they were screaming about it. No decades of mass violent ethnic cleansing. No longest belligerent occupation of modern times. No longest belligerent siege of modern times. No massive land theft and illegal colonisation. No apartheid. No mass arbitrary incarceration of Palestinians, including children, in military jails, often with no charge whatsoever. No violent subjugation. Indeed, thousands of Palestinians were killed between 2008 and the 6th of October, 2023. In fact, of all of those killed in the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict, 96% were Palestinian. up to the 6th of October. Indeed, if we're just talking about 2023 in the West Bank alone, before the 7th of October, 240 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank that year, before the 7th of October. 40 of them were children. If they'd been Israelis killed by Palestinian paramilitaries, including 40 Israeli children, do you think Dana Bash would be talking about ceasefire? Would she describe that as a ceasefire? No, she wouldn't. She would call that a reign of terror against Israelis. That's what she'd be talking about. Indeed, if you had even a tenth of that amount of blood spilled, where Israelis had been the victims, then there would have just been a military assault by the Israeli state. I think we know that, don't we? Now, those saying there were a ceasefire on 6th of October are just being racist. I'm not using racist lightly here. It's a very obvious thought experiment to prove. If that many Israelis had been killed by Palestinians last year, before the 7th of October, would you call it a ceasefire? No, you wouldn't. You only call it a ceasefire in these circumstances because you don't think Palestinian life has equal worth. What other convincing explanation is there? Please tell me, I'd love to know. Because you just wouldn't be calling it a ceasefire in that context. Of course you wouldn't. Bear in mind, she's supposed to be an objective broadcast journalist, by the way. You probably look at this and think, well, she's like a polemicist, she's a pundit. No, she's not. She's their flagship reporter. She then says, now protesting the way the Israeli government, the Israeli Prime Minister, is prosecuting the retaliatory war against Hamas is one thing. Not even pretending, is she? Wow. What she's discussing here, this retaliatory war against Hamas, involves the mass slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians, including those buried under the rubble, at least 40 times more than the number of Israelis killed on the 7th of October. And bear in mind, the population of Gaza is over 4 times smaller. It includes the mass slaughter of children, with somewhere between 14,000 and 20,000 kids killed. And bear in mind, we would all agree that the 36 Israeli kids killed on the 7th of October was an unacceptable crime. Where do that many thousand Palestinian kids factor in then? The mass destruction of most of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, so it now looks like a different colour and texture when looked at from space. The destruction of Gaza's entire healthcare system itself, imposing a daily death sentence on countless numbers of Palestinians. A manufactured famine, involving the swiftest fall of the nutritional status of a population ever recorded, caused by a deliberate Israeli siege. She calls this a retaliatory war against Hamas and suggests protests should be about the way it's been prosecuted, if they exist at all, and the way we'd criticise, I don't know, how our president's approaching healthcare reform rather than one of the most murderous and destructive military onslaughts of our age. She then says, making Jewish students feel unsafe at their own schools is unacceptable and is happening way too much right now. But of course the safety of Jewish students is absolutely paramount. What about the Jewish students who've been centrally involved in these protests? What about the Jewish students who got attacked by pro-Israel protesters? Because they were there in that camp. You can see, in fact, Jews for Palestinians. You could see a big placard at the encampment being attacked by those by those thugs, and by police, like their fellow students. Many of them, of course, huge numbers are being arrested. These encampments have actually gone to great lengths to be inclusive, including holding Seders and Shabbat. Let's listen to Nara Milinich, a Jewish academic, a professor of history at Columbia, who spoke to me last week. When people say that, this is now a hotbed of anti-Semitism, and that's what this protest is and encampment's really all about, and it's a threat to Jewish safety.
Yeah, I wish they would come on campus and see, except for that the university has off and on been allowing press even on campus. Campus is now sort of closed off, so only affiliates with IDs can typically swipe in. They've let in press sometimes they don't let press in, and that just sort of foments this narrative. I can say, as a Jewish faculty member, I'm happy to walk on campus, and I do it multiple times a day. I would say also that Jewish students are many of those who are being arrested. I mean, some of the student, leaders of this movement are Jewish students. Many of the students in the encampment are Jewish, are Jewish students, and again, students from a variety of other groups. So this idea is just frankly not true.
Now, the CNN correspondent then says, after a clip of UCLA students arguing with pro-Palestinian protesters, again, what you just saw is 2024 in Los Angeles, harkening back to the 1930s in Europe, and I do not say that lightly. The fear among Jews in this country is palpable right now. Wow, just wow. Firstly, we have no idea about the context here whatsoever, because all we can see is some protesters standing there saying nothing while a student yells at them, but you can see lots of people walking past him. The claim is being barred from entering campus because he's Jewish. What's the evidence for that? given the number of Jewish protesters involved? What's the evidence he's being blocked? Where's the menace of physical violence there? There's absolutely no context whatsoever for what's happening there whatsoever. What she has done there is obscenely belittle the horror of 1930s Europe, when Jews and other targets of the Nazis and their fascist allies were suffering murderous persecution. And she has the front to say, I don't say that lightly. This is a travesty of so-called journalism. It's naked propaganda, no better than Fox News. Worse, actually, because at least Fox News doesn't pretend to be respectable. Now, to say she has form is an understatement, to say the least. Listen to how she responded last December when Representative Pramila Jayapal put forward statistics about the number of Palestinians, mostly women and children, being butchered.
15,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes, 3/4 of whom are women and children.
And it's horrible, but you don't see Israeli soldiers raping
well, Dana, I
Palestinian
think
women.
we're not.
I don't even know what to say. Wow, just wow. For a start, the United Nations has documented, by the way, Palestinian women being raped by Israeli soldiers. And there is ample evidence of both female and male Palestinian detainees being sexually abused by the IDF. And Save the Children report that Palestinian child detainees were sexually abused in the West Bank before 7th of October. Yeah, that's right, during the so-called ceasefire Dana Bash likes to refer to. But what kind of answer is that? What kind of answer is that? You listen to someone talking about the mass slaughter of children, and you respond by saying, well, you don't see Israeli soldiers raping them. What kind of mind works like that? Now, let's just listen to a final segment from CNN from today.
16. Good morning to all of you. Some pretty stunning images coming to us overnight, Evan. We also are just learning at this hour that banners have been hung from the hall. They read Hind's Hall and Intifada. Hind is a reference to a woman who was killed in Gaza. Intifada, of course, a reference to uprising, violent struggles that Palestinians have had over the years against Israel. As you watch this...
Notice what they said there? A woman who was killed. A woman. Do you know who the woman she's talking about is? 6-year-old Hind Rajab. A 6-year-old. She called a 6-year-old murdered girl a woman. A 6-year-old who's slaughtered by the Israeli state. Desperately terrified, we know, because we could hear her last conversation on the phone to a Palestine Red Crescent respondent, where she was surrounded by the slaughtered bodies of her relatives, where she said she was scared of the dark and begged them to get her. Slaughtered along with her family, many of them also children. You heard her 15-year-old cousin butchered, whilst also speaking to a responder. And then the 2 paramedics sent to save her in an ambulance, slaughtered. That ambulance blown up by the Israeli military, and then the Israeli military lied about all of it. How sick is this? How twisted? Do you know what I mean? It's kind of sick, isn't it? It's fucked. Let's just say it. I've often wondered how those who fail to speak out against this, one of the great atrocities of our age, how they manage to live with themselves knowing that so many children have been killed and are being killed every day in the most hideous, violent and terrifying ways imaginable. Buried under rubble, suffocating. Toddlers being cooked, slowly alive, by a missile which blows up their home, listening maybe to the screams of their dying parents buried under the same rubble. Imagine the terror of a 3-year-old girl in those circumstances. Maybe trapped there for hours in the most excruciating agony before she perishes. How do they live with themselves knowing all that? Well, now we know, don't we? They just pretend they're grown-ups. And let's face it, they don't think any of them are human. Not really. Nobody who believes the Palestinians are equal human beings with the same worth as the people they see as like themselves would ever tolerate this atrocity for even a second more. So what's this all about? What's this vile propaganda from CNN and the likes of Dana Bash all about? I'll tell you. These people are morally disgraced. They hitched themselves onto a bandwagon now drenched in so much blood. They've lost public opinion, including in the United States, and they're going to get done by history. And they also face the very real prospect of accountability. That is the role they played in the media in justifying and normalising what Israel did. And they're too far in now. They know it's too far. There's no going back. I'm not exaggerating when I say these people have played a significant role in the mass slaughter of innocent people, because if the media had called this out for what it was from the start, this would not have been possible. So all they've got now is desperation, knowing deep down they're morally disgraced in the eyes of ever-growing numbers of people. What do then? They go, look over there, the real extremists, the people who, checks notes, oppose genocide and the mass slaughter of innocent children. But that's not going to work. It's not going to work. Maybe once upon a time this might have worked, but this whole disgusting episode, Israel's genocidal slaughter of Gaza, will, in my view, have disastrous long-term consequences for these mainstream media outlets. The crime is simply too big. It's too blatant. It's too shameless. Too many people have seen things they can't unsee. And because of the internet, we have access to what Israel is really doing, what Israeli leaders are really saying, and what protesters are really about. People can see the truth, no matter how much mainstream media outlets twist and distort and lie by omission and turn the world upside down. They see people who see all this. They see how media outlets lie about it. And know that their audiences are massively tilted towards older Americans. And by the way, there are many older Americans who are taking a courageous stand against this, and indeed have taken courageous stands against horrors all their lives. But it is notable that younger Americans are overwhelmingly the most hostile to what's happening, and they're the ones using social media and the internet, where they can see what Israel is doing unfiltered, and then they can see how the media lies about it. So Dan the Bash and the like can utterly disgrace themselves in public, which they are. But all they're doing is accelerating the downfall of these media outlets. And when that happens, and they'll see it happening, they shouldn't be shocked. They did it to themselves. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Do leave your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. Always read through. Help keep the show on the road. Help us take on these sorts of pro-war outlets on patreon.com/OwenJames84. Listen to us on the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.